wanted to ask you about what mass timber is really, and if it also falls into the same definition as cross-laminated timber. I'm trying to figure out the terminology here.
Right. Yeah, it's a little bit tricky. There are lots of different types of wood construction, and they can loosely be categorized in three ways. One is the kind of dimensional lumber that people associate with building a house, or sometimes you'll see, a 3 or 4 story multifamily building being constructed using 2x4s and all the same kinds of materials you would build your house out of. But then beyond that, there are two other types of wood construction. One is called heavy timber, which has kind of always been with us. Heavy timber is, if you think of an old mill building or an old warehouse from the 19th century, big timber, logs essentially that have been planed down and used for columns and beams. So that's heavy timber, and that's always been in our building code. It's a construction type called Type 4, to get a little technical. And then there's this new category of wood construction, which is called mass timber. And what mass timber is, it's essentially it's constructing planar elements from timber. So imagine if you were to take a piece of plywood and scale it up so that now it's 6 inches thick, for example, that creates a panel of wood. That's what falls into that category of mass timber. So mass timber also can include, it can be combined with heavy timber. So you can have columns and beams made out of heavy timber, and then the mass timber component that goes on to that, either as exterior walls, interior walls, or floors and ceilings and roofs. And the reason it's important to distinguish between them is that you can combine these systems in a number of different ways. So mass timber, within the designation of mass timber, there are a number of different ways of creating those wood planes. One of those is cross-laminated timber. There's also dowel laminated timber. There's nail laminated timber. There's half a dozen or more of these ways of creating mass timber panels.
Makes sense. And I guess just I was trying to do some research about cross-laminated timber. It seems like a relatively new technology. Is this something that really came about maybe in mid 2010s? It looks like.
It's been with us for a while. I'm not 100% certain of the exact origins of it, but I know that in parts of Europe it's been prevalent for quite some time. I think probably since the 1990s. Don't hold me to that. And the Canadian construction industry has gotten a hold of it and become much more commonplace and much more facile with it than we have in this country. And in fact, the Canadian building codes have already incorporated mass timber into their laws, and we're still catching up to that here a little bit. We have that Type 4 designation that I mentioned before that covers heavy timber, and so it's a really new thing in the United States. It's less new to our neighbors up north, and it's certainly been around long enough to be a proven technology in other parts of the world for for high-rise construction and certainly smaller things as well.
And mass timber is a big part of the proposal for you guys at Parcel 8 in
Yeah.
terms of being a really transformative, unique new project and using this technology. For this project, maybe talking about Parcel 8 again here, why was mass timber or what were some reasons mass timber was a great option for this and trying to go green and trying to build something really new and unique?
So just first of all, Parcel 8, for those who don't know, is our project in Nubian Square that we proposed. It's not our project, it's our proposal. Hopefully it will become our project. The building is called Gateway Nubian, and it is a tall building on the corner of Washington and Melnia Cass in Boston. And we proposed that the building be constructed with mass timber and with heavy timber on top of the podium. There's a height limit that you can achieve with mass timber and with heavy timber. So that's why we're combining the systems. And the choice was made to go that way for a couple of really important reasons. The first one, which is probably the most obvious, is the sustainability aspect of using wood in a building as opposed to steel or concrete, because wood is a renewable resource, because it is a carbon store. It contributes much more positively, let's say, to the impact of a building on its environment in terms of the resources that are used to build it, the shipping of those resources, things like off-gassing, and what actually happens to the environment once the building is in place. So that was the first consideration. The second consideration, which is equally important and maybe even a little more important for that project because of some of the social issues that are being addressed. It's a predominantly an affordable housing building, and one of the goals of that particular building is to combat systemic racism and to deal with issues of social justice and wealth creation for a traditionally disadvantaged community. Um, and so because the mass timber industry is a new thing, and because it's up and coming in the United States, and in particular in the Northeast, we see that building as an opportunity for our constructors, Janie and Co., predominant among them, to really take hold of the opportunity to train a new workforce and to look within the existing boundaries, if you will, of the Nubian Square community, and find a new path toward that wealth generation and consistent income that I mentioned. So we're looking at it as a tool to be uh, kind of social justice warriors, for lack of a better term, to provide opportunities.
And do you, as far as just the city of Boston, I know you touched on some of the, I believe it was the code four, or I'm sorry, you just said it, the
Type 4.
type four designation in Boston. As far as going with the mass timber project in Boston, does Boston zoning, do Boston building codes currently allow this type of construction, or is it as far as the city of Boston's reception to these types of construction? Because there is projects uh, being using CLT, but I was just
Mhm.
curious if how friendly the codes are, or if the BPDA city codes are kind of just finding out about or this is very new for them as well.
Yeah. It is new. It's the type of thing, though, that depends partially on how tall you're trying to build in terms of what kinds of roadblocks you run into with codes and with local agencies. And um, Boston, like most cities and most states in the U.S., uses what's called the International Building Code as its kind of dominant uh, you know set of rules for how we put buildings together. And the IBC gets updated every few years, and there's an update coming in 2021 that is going to incorporate um, these technologies for the first time and really try to address them headlong. And I mentioned when I started answering the question, I mentioned the issue of height. Um, Currently, you can build buildings with mass timber and with heavy timber up to a certain height limit. But because the mass timber part of it that we talked about earlier is a new designation, there had to be new considerations given to what the research and what the experiences of these other places that have used this technology for a while have learned about building taller than what currently is allowed in the heavy timber portions of the code. Um, so those things are being relooked at, and we're going to have a little easier time, I think, going forward building tall buildings. You can still do it, but there are certain exceptions that you have to look for if you go above 85 feet, I think is the current limit. Um, we know that we can build a lot taller than that using heavy timber and mass timber. But again, those previous codes were based on older technologies from really 19th century construction techniques.
And just speaking about these mass timber builds in general across the U.S., I did see that there's some projects. I believe in Chicago. There was some activity in Portland. Activity in the Northeast, or I guess a little on the East Coast, seemed light when it came to mass timber. And I was curious if maybe there was any specific reason as to why. Maybe was it getting the materials transported to the East Coast, maybe cost, maybe even tariffs. I was just curious, maybe what you think were some of the obstacles for these builds to just now begin to spring up out here.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think a lot of it could potentially just have to do with proximity to where the kind of ground zero of these technologies is coming from. Vancouver, British Columbia, has been a real hotbed of the Canadian construction industry. Getting familiarity. What used to be the tallest timber building in the world, I'm not sure if it still is. I think it is a new dormitory building at UBC, and I think it's 18 stories, if I'm not mistaken. So there's always been a lot of interest and a lot of knowledge about these techniques in Canada, and particularly on the west coast of Canada. So I think part of it just stems from that kind of flow of information. That's why we're seeing a lot of activity in Washington and Oregon. They've already those two states have already made exceptions to their own ways of treating the code that allow different techniques than the rest of us have gotten. There's been activity in Minneapolis. There's a very prominent project there, and you mentioned Chicago. And you and I spoke previously about our project at Parcel 8 being, the first really significant one east of the Mississippi. Specifically as to why it hasn't, kind of gone across the Mississippi in a real dominant way yet, I'm not sure. There have been mass timber buildings, as you mentioned, under construction and already built in Massachusetts. They just haven't been very tall. I think the one at UMass Amherst is 3 or 4 stories. And so that's been pretty consistent in terms of the types of buildings that have been built this way in the east of the United States. So we're hoping to really, kind of push the envelope there and try to lead the way and point the way toward a brighter future, both for the construction industry and for the sustainability components involved in these tall buildings.
And I was reading actually a WBUR article about the Roxbury structure that's CLT. I believe it's 5 stories,
Mhm.
and there was a developer in the project quoted as saying that it's not the cheapest material to work with, and versus and I was curious, maybe just a quick question about cost. Because is this technology pricier because it's new, and would because maybe factories in Washington, Oregon, transportation, just because the factories, the infrastructure for constructing it isn't in the Northeast, does that maybe drive up the cost a bit more?
Um, so the economic question is an interesting one. I'm a little bit not sure. I do know that specific to cross-laminated timber (CLT), I know that the industry, I think, comes largely, the product comes largely from Canada, and I think Austria in Europe. But as I mentioned, there are several different types of mass timber beyond just CLT. So nail laminated timber is exactly what it sounds like. It's essentially taking 2x4s and nailing them together on top of each other. So that type of thing, I think, is dowel laminated timber. The other ones come from other places. So I don't know that the shipping is really an issue in terms of the cost, because if you think of steel, we get steel from all over the world. Same thing with concrete; it doesn't always necessarily come locally. So my hunch is that it's probably just that wood costs a little more to harvest and process than other things do. Uh, the flip side of that, though, is that it's lighter and it's usually more locally resourced. If you think of wood from Canada, which is just across the border from where we live here, certainly less than 500 miles, as opposed to steel coming from China. Imagine how much gasoline has to be burned in order to get that piece of steel from China to the U.S. and then from the West Coast to the East Coast. So that cost gets driven down potentially a little bit, but then the payback comes when you erect the buildings out of wood. They go up much faster than they do certainly with concrete or steel, and so contractors and developers are able to, win back some of the expense that they've laid out for the more expensive material on save time and save manpower on the job site. So they're saving money there, and then they're also, occupying their buildings faster and uh, collecting their rents or their mortgages or their sales quicker.
That completely makes sense. And just wanted to ask, as maybe just wrapping up here, as far as the Parcel 8 proposal, or maybe just mass timber builds in general, with the codes. I apologize. The 2021 update to the Mass
And so,
Timber International Code. Do you think that's going to be a real spark for developers to really consider this, now that uh, cities are becoming more open to it, developers are learning more about the project, and yeah, there's towers being built, across the country in America now. Do you think that it's poised for maybe not an explosion of development, but at least a rise in development, a rise in awareness?
yeah, I sure hope so. You know, I'm a principal at Zephyr Architects, and my co-principals Jason and Chris and I have had a lot of conversations over the last few years about ways that we can do our part, do our due diligence as the design community to really make sure that we bring this technology uh, to the table when we're having conversations with developers we work with engineers, with constructors, and really start designing from that point of view of, hey, this is a really promising thing that we can do for ourselves as an industry that will benefit, like I said earlier, potentially the environment, the social constructs that we're building our buildings in, and just be a much better solution to the problems of, you know, habitation that we have on this planet right now. Um, so we at Zephyr are really anticipating, bringing this conversation up every chance we get. And I'm hopeful that other architects will as well. And I also hope that the developers out there will, look for innovative ways and see the big picture of how to build their buildings in ways that not only save them time and money, but that create equitable futures for everyone involved.
Awesome. And is there anything else you'd like to add?
Um, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. I think there's a real opportunity that we have right now at this moment in time with this technology, and especially in Boston and Massachusetts, where the governor has identified that we have such a shortage of housing. I think looking at that problem through the lens of sustainability, and especially through the lens of mass timber and heavy timber, uh, could be a really cool way of addressing several issues at once, and that's what we're really trying to do with Zephyr.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate the time. Thanks for the chat. That those definitions are very helpful. And